intent, you can add these different pieces to your mead, just as if when you're thinking about building a mead and you're on paper going, well, I think I'm going to do this and that and the other thing, you can add these pieces to the mead just as well once you know and understand what can be had.
So we have a listener question. Why do we use oak instead of other woods?
That's a great question. There is actually a company called Black Swan Cooperage, and you can buy from them other species of wood. In fact, I bought, I think they might have, I want to say maybe 7, 8, maybe 9 different species, and each of those different species also will have their own nuances that are special towards that particular piece of wood. I think maybe why, the wine industry has been using oak since they started transporting oak across the ocean, right? They would fill them up in these big wooden barrels, and so I think maybe those types of trees, because sometimes they're rather large, and so you could cut one tree down and get an awful lot of material to work with. And then there's huge forests that are filled with oak. I think it might have initially started because of just the sheer fact that there was a lot of it around to be used. I really don't know that for sure, but yeah.
And how a lot of our research is more geared towards wine because more wine is made than mead.
Well, sure. As we all know, I think mead was very close probably to falling off the planet, so to speak, where we've kind of re-sparked an ancient tradition or mythology or whatever that seemingly almost disappeared. And, of course, wine hasn't done that. And so I think we're really riding on the backs of what we've learned from the wine people. I know when you talk about how a wine presents and the flavors and the structure and all of this, they actually say that maybe as much as 50% of the presentation of that particular wine comes from the wood component. No, I didn't realize that until, maybe just in the last year or so. So it has a huge impact. It's unfortunate so many people, when I think, and I hear this some, well, I don't really like oak. I think, and I ask them, and I think that most of the time what they're saying is, I don't like the flavor of a campfire, and they think about bourbons, right? And a bourbon is very oaky. For it to be a bourbon, it has to be aged, one-time used American oak, and they generally char it to help to purify the distillation leftovers and whatnot. And so, yes, it's very in-your-face oak, campfire kind of notes. And most of people, that's where they stop. They go, that's all that I know about oak, and I don't want that in my meat. And I can understand that. One of the things I try to do all the time, not with just oak, but with spices and fruits and all of the different pieces that I'm putting in my mead, I like to, most of the time, have them fly under the radar. And I do that a lot with oak, and I actually do a lot of layering with different types of oak and different toast levels. And so it's a thing where it's not strong enough that you can pick it out, but if you took it out, you would definitely notice a huge difference. And so that's kind of one of the things that I always try to do with my meads in general, is I'd like to add a lot of complexity and some mystery where you can't just pull it out and go, oh, this is, this or that. You go, I taste something there, and I'm kind of trying to grab a hold of what it is. And so really, to me, that's one of the better ways to use oak, is not to make it so pronounced that immediately somebody goes, oh, well, that's an American oak, and that's great if you can pick them out. I know some people that can. But I think most of the time, if we use it and kind of use it at just under that threshold where it becomes really pronounced, I think that's really where the magic lies in it most of the time.
Yeah, I think everybody who's, played with oak chips has probably managed to make Chateau plywood at least once.
And that's a great point, and I'm glad you brought that up, because that was something that I wanted to encourage our listeners to understand. I think, a lot of people, they'll buy wine kits, and in the wine kits there comes oak chips that the instructions say to use, right?
And that's exactly how I made my Chateau plywood.
Well, exactly, and that's a lot of people's beginning and end of their oak experience. Keep in mind, when these people are making their wine kits, they've actually tested it out, many times with all of the different ingredients, and so they're trying to give to Joe Blow winemaker something that's very easy, that they don't have to get all involved in and know a whole boatload of stuff. And so they already know that by adding those chips into the must, it's going to give the end result which they're looking for. But here's the thing that everybody's gripe is, and I totally agree with it, about chips. When we take oak, and the cooperages will fire them in their ovens, or they'll either use that or they'll use a raw fire, an actual, fire. Imagine this: if you've got a big piece of wood and you put it next to the fire, of course, the outer perimeter of that piece of wood is the first thing that's exposed to the fire, right? So then, as the wood sits there, that outer edge continues to get darker and darker in color, and the heat begins to move into the center of the oak. And so, at the end of the day, imagine if you took the post that your clothes hangers are hanging on, that, 1.5 inch in diameter piece of round wood, and you toasted that next to a fire and then cut it in half. Now, when you look at the end, you would actually be able to see with your eyes a color gradient where it's darker, and depending on how much they toasted it, it might be black, it might be charcoal on the outside. And then as you work towards the center of that piece of oak, the color gradient starts to get lighter and lighter and lighter until eventually the fire didn't do anything to the very center of that piece of wood. So now what they've done is they've added either higher or lesser gradients of temperature to the wood, which has cooked the sugars inside the wood at a different level. And so now when you add staves, you're getting that full gamut of that expression from very raw wood all the way up to whatever toast level they made that at, and it stopped it there. With the chips, they're so small, they're so thin, and they're so uniform that when they toast them, it goes right through the whole thing. And it's either one color, dark brown, it's tan. In other words, it's all one color. The temperature was the same all the way through the piece. And so you get a very mineral expression of oak, and it's really, I don't know, it's just not very good. You don't have very much. Go ahead.
I think the other thing with oak chips versus anything else is you've got to consider your surface area to volume ratio, and how fast everything comes out of it. So what I plan to do next time to avoid the Chateau plywood issue, because I plan to do what I did there again, I'll just use half as many for twice as long.
Right, and that's you're already in front of me. That's another thing I was going to say. When we talk about extraction rates, some of our different oaks, the species themselves, the extraction rate is much faster than some of the other species. And mostly there you're talking about the size of the tree, the amount of growing season that tree has. So some trees can grow for 6 or 7 or 8 months before they kind of shut down for winter, and other trees, they only have a 4 or 5 month long growth period. And then, of course, depending on their altitude and the weather and all of this or that, they may grow to be huge trees or they may grow to be very small. Generally, a small tree has a much finer grain in the wood itself than a rather large tree does. And so if you've got a piece of wood with very large cells, the extraction rate from that piece of wood is going to be much faster than a piece of wood that's very dense and hard, and the cellular structure is minute compared to that other tree. So the different oaks will have an extraction rate, one that's different to the other. And I think, in my opinion, if we could arrive at the end point from two different directions. We can use a boatload of oak for a short period of time, or we can use a smaller amount of oak for a very long period of time. In my opinion, if we use the smaller amount for a longer duration of time, now all of that time that it's soaking up and extracting all of the goodies that comes out of that oak, the longer it can sit in there to full extraction, I think you're actually extracting that full gamut of the color wheel, so to speak, which would also then equate to the full gamut of the different flavor parts and pieces. And so I would say, if you're thinking, well, should I use a whole bunch and go fast, I seem to think that the less you use and the longer you take to use it, you get more complexity out of it all.
Well, that would make sense, because you've got some of the things that you're releasing into your mead or wine are going to be more volatile than others. So if you do a really short duration, you're only going to get all the stuff that blows out fast. And if you leave it in for a good long time, then you're more likely to get more of everything that's in there, right?
Yeah, I mean, we're not going to throw in an 8x8 piece of wood in a carboy for sure, right, or a trash can or whatever your vessel is. But, and I don't really know what the real answer here is, but my point is, the bigger the piece of wood, you could, in theory, let's just say for grins, for the reason of the explanation, if you threw an 8-inch chunk of wood in there, I could maybe imagine that it would take 3 months for the inside of that piece of wood to become saturated with your must.
Yeah, well, that's the exact same. It's the same thing as using staves versus using chips, right? It's going to take a longer. It'll take a longer time to extract, but you'll get a more complex flavor.
Exactly. And I've also found that when we use spirals, which I like spirals quite a lot, I've really moved to use, I think they're called okers or zokers. I'm not even sure how do you pronounce something when it has an X in front of it. But more wine sells these big balls that are, I don't know how many of our listeners have ever peeled the outer shell of a golf ball off, but generally inside there, there's a smaller ball inside the
question about white oak.
Yeah, sure, great. Go ahead.
Jaden's saying that Steve Piat says to use white oak. What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know for sure. So I know that we have different species. We have an American oak there are more than just 3, but generally when you go to the store, you get in the catalogs, you could buy an American oak, Hungarian oak, and French oak. I would think if he's talking about white oak, he's probably talking about American oak, although I don't know that you could toss out Hungarian and French and say, well, they don't have any white in those woods either. I don't really know that. So the white piece there kind of throws me for a loop that I really don't have a good answer for. But I can tell you...
research.
Yeah, exactly. So we talked already about the different species being American, Hungarian, and French, and some of those trees are smaller, and they have very tight grains, and others are very large. And then, of course, anywhere where a plant grows, it's going to absorb the nutrients out of the soil, and so some of those particular trees have more of a mineral piece to them than some of the other trees, and so that's kind of the difference. How one oak is different to the other because of the tree itself and where that tree grew up. And now this is probably the most important thing that maybe people don't understand is what we call seasoning. These guys will cut down their oak and they'll cut them into large planks like floor joists. And then maybe they'll cut them 4 or 5 feet long and they'll stack them like, what's that game where you pull out?
Jenga.
The Jenga. They'll stack them like a Jenga thing out in the open forest or in their yard at the manufacturing facility, and they'll let them season there for 3 years, sometimes 2.